years working the freight lines through eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia, and I've seen things on those tracks at 2 in the morning that most people couldn't stomach. Deer caught under the wheels, a car somebody left on the crossing on purpose, a man sitting completely still in a lawn chair, about 4 feet from the rail, as we came through a cut at 50 miles an hour, just sitting there, not reacting to the horn, not reacting to anything. We never found out who he was or why he was there. That kind of thing stops bothering you after a while. Or you tell yourself it does. But what happened to me in the fall of 2009 in the Breaks Interstate Park area near the Virginia border is something I have never been able to stop thinking about. And I've tried harder than most people realize. I wasn't working that night. I want that clear too. I'd taken 2 weeks off after my dad passed in September, and my buddy Dale Hutchins had a cabin up near the breaks that he said I could use as long as I needed. Dale's a good man. He figured being out in the woods near the gorge might do me some good, get me out of the apartment I'd been sitting in for 2 weeks, eating frozen dinners and watching the Weather Channel with the sound off. He was right. The first 3 days up there were genuinely peaceful. I hiked the Ridge Trail in the mornings, cooked on the propane stove, slept better than I had in months. The cabin was maybe a quarter mile from the main road on a gravel track, surrounded by second-growth oak and hickory, and the closest neighbor was a good mile away. Dale had told me a retired school teacher named Bev Sizemore lived up the next hollow, and that if I ever needed anything, she was the one to go to. On the fourth night, around 11 o'clock, I was sitting on the front porch with a glass of bourbon and no particular thoughts in my head when the dog started acting strange. I should explain that part first. I'd brought my dog Clyde with me, a 6-year-old black lab mix who was about as even-tempered a dog as you could ask for. Clyde slept through thunderstorms. Clyde didn't even flinch when fireworks went off directly overhead. Clyde was the opposite of a high-strung animal, which is exactly why I sat up straight in my chair when he started making a sound I had never heard him make before in 6 years. It wasn't barking. It wasn't quite growling either. It was this low, continuous sound from somewhere deep in his chest, almost mechanical, like a machine idling. And he was staring at the tree line to the left of the cabin, which was just black dark at that hour. I watched where he was looking for a while. I didn't see anything. I told him to quit it. He didn't quit it. He actually inched backward until his hindquarters were against the cabin wall, which he'd never done in his life. Clyde didn't retreat from things. That was the thing that got me, more than the sound. The retreat. I went inside and got my flashlight, one of those big mag lights that doubles as a club, and came back out to the porch. I swept the beam along the tree line. Nothing. Just trees and the undergrowth and a little ground fog collecting at the base of the hollow. Clyde was still pressed against the wall. I walked down the porch steps and moved the flashlight slower this time, really looking. And that's when I saw the shape. Now I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've replayed it so many times in my head that I'm not totally sure anymore where the memory ends and the interpretation begins. What I can say for certain is that there was a shape at the edge of the tree line that had not been there a few seconds before. It was the approximate size and outline of a standing person, maybe a hair taller than a normal person, but close enough that my first thought was just that somebody was standing in my tree line at 11 o'clock at night, which is its own kind of alarming. I called out, asked if someone was there, if they needed help, if they were lost. No response. The shape didn't move. I kept the flashlight on it, and I remember the beam catching something where the face would have been, just a brief reflection, like you get when light hits an animal's eyes. Except it was at head height for a standing person, not low to the ground like it would be for a deer or a coyote or anything else on 4 legs. I am not proud of what I did next, which was to go inside, close and lock the door, and sit in the main room with the mag light in my hand until it got light out. Clyde came inside with me and sat on my feet the entire time, which in 6 years of owning him he had done exactly never. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something on the porch. Not heavy footsteps, not a crash. Just the boards giving a very slight, very deliberate creak. 3 or 4 of them in sequence, like someone picking their way across carefully. And then nothing. And then the sound of Clyde's low, idling sound starting up again from right beside me. In the morning, I went out with the light and looked at the porch. The boards were old and soft, and you could see where things walked across them in the way the grain compressed. There were impressions across the porch. They were large and they were 2-footed, and they stopped at the window closest to where I'd been sitting inside. I left the cabin that morning. I called Dale from the road and told him I was heading home. He asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I lied. I packed up my dad's old watch that I'd brought with me and put Clyde in the truck and drove the 3 hours back to Hazard and didn't think about going back to those woods until years later. And I only thought about it then because Dale called me to say that a hunter from Virginia had found something up on the ridge behind the cabin. A tree, he said, about 60 yards into the woods from the clearing. Branches snapped off at about 8 or 9 feet high, all the way around the trunk, like something had stood against it and leaned its full weight in from every direction. The hunter thought it might be a bear marking territory. Dale said maybe, but he asked me how tall I thought a bear would have to be to snap branches at 9 feet, and I didn't have a good answer for him, and neither did he. And we both left it there because there wasn't anywhere else to go with it. Story 2, submitted by Donna Pruitt, 38, Home Health Aide, Lordsburg, New Mexico. My mother always said I had bad luck with houses. The first apartment I rented on my own had a mold problem that took 8 months and 2 lawyers to get the landlord to address. The second place I rented had a neighbor who played drums from 10 at night until 2 in the morning without fail. The house I bought in 2017 outside Lordsburg, though, that was a different category of bad altogether. And it took me a long time to be able to write this down without my hands shaking. Lordsburg is a small city in Hidalgo County, right near the New Mexico-Arizona line. It's one of those places that exists primarily because the railroad came through in the 1880s, and people just stayed. It's flat, hot, mostly quiet, and the kind of place where everybody knows at least somebody who knows everybody else. The house I bought was a 2-bedroom adobe on the east edge of town, built in 1951. And the price was low enough that I didn't ask as many questions as I should have. My realtor, a pleasant enough woman named Cecilia Trujillo, told me the previous owner had passed away in the house, which legally she had to disclose, and that it had sat empty for about 18 months before going to sale. I told her that didn't bother me. Old people die in old houses all the time, and that's just how it goes. The first month I was there was fine. I painted the kitchen, got the swamp cooler working, planted a few things along the front walk that I knew full well the heat would kill by August. The house felt a little heavy, which I chalked up to it having been empty so long. Unoccupied spaces always feel that way to me, like the air has gone stale, not just physically, but in some other harder-to-name way. I figured it would lift once I got settled. It didn't lift. If anything, it got heavier as the weeks went on. I started having trouble sleeping, which wasn't something I'd ever dealt with before. I'd wake up at the same time every night, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, for no reason I could identify. No sound, no bad dream, just suddenly awake with my heart going a little faster than it should be. I'd lie there listening to the house, and the house would be completely quiet. And after 15 or 20 minutes, I'd drift back off. This happened every single night for about 6 weeks. I told myself it was the new environment, the different sounds a new house makes, the way the heating and cooling worked differently than I was used to. Then one night I woke up at the usual time and the bedroom door was open. I was certain I'd closed it before bed because I developed the habit of closing it once the nighttime wake-ups started some instinct toward containment, I guess. I lay there looking at the dark rectangle of the open doorway for a while, and then I got up and looked into the hall. Nothing. I closed the door again and went back to bed. The door was open again when I woke in the morning. I checked the latch. It was fine, secure. No reason it would drift. I started latching it instead of just pulling it shut, threading the tongue fully into the strike plate. The next morning, it was open again. I put a small piece of tape across the frame where the door met the jamb. The tape was broken in the morning, which meant the door had been opened from inside the room, not from the hall, which was not possible because I was the only person in that house. I want to be precise about my state of mind at that point. I was not frightened in any dramatic way. I was unsettled the way you get when something doesn't add up and the non-frightening explanations keep running out. I was still going to work every day, still having dinner with my coworker Paulette on Thursdays, still functioning totally normally. But something was off in that house, and I couldn't square it away. The thing that finally moved me to action happened about 3 months in. I'd been doing a long overnight shift, got home around 7 in the morning, showered, and sat down in the kitchen with coffee. I was tired enough that I wasn't thinking too hard about anything. I was just sitting there, looking out the back window at the scrubby yard and the fence line and the open desert beyond, and I saw in my backyard a person. They were standing very still near the back fence, maybe 20 feet from the house, facing the rear wall. My first clear thought was that someone had come in over the fence, maybe a kid cutting through or someone in some kind of distress. I went to the back door and opened it and called out. The person didn't move. I called out again, louder. Nothing. And then, standing in my own back doorway in the morning heat with my coffee still in my hand, I got the first real cold, unambiguous fear I'd felt since moving in, because the person was standing too still. Not the stillness of someone who hasn't heard you, the stillness of something that is aware of you and is choosing not to respond. I went back inside and watched from the window. The figure was there for maybe another 30 seconds, and then it wasn't. Not in the sense of walking away or moving behind anything. It was simply gone between one moment and the next. I had not looked away. I had not blinked, or if I had, only for a fraction of a second. I called Cecilia Trujillo that afternoon, not in an accusatory way, just asking her if she knew anything more about the history of the house, the previous owner, whether there had been anything unusual reported. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd heard from a neighbor that the man who died there, his name was Ernesto Gallegos, had been found in the backyard, collapsed from a heart attack near the fence line. He'd been there for 2 days before a neighbor called it in because nobody had seen him. I sold the house 14 months after I bought it. I lost money on it. I would lose that money again 100 times over if it meant I never had to sleep in that place another night. I've never told my mother about any of this. She'd only say she told me so. Story 3, submitted by Brett Calloway, 29, wildland firefighter, Flagstaff, Arizona. There are things that happen to people in very remote places that don't make it into any official report, and the reason for that isn't a conspiracy. The reason is a lot simpler and a lot more human. When you're out in the field in the middle of nowhere and something happens that you can't explain, the last thing you want to do is come back to the station and put it in writing. You want to keep your job. You want your crew to still trust your judgment. You want to be the kind of person who reads situations clearly and doesn't lose their head. And nothing undermines that reputation faster than filing a report that says you saw something you can't account for in a canyon in northern Arizona at 4 in the morning. So I didn't file a report, and I'm writing this now, 3 years later, because it's been sitting in the back of my head long enough and I need it somewhere outside of me. This was the summer of 2021. Late July, one of the worst fire seasons the Four Corners region had seen in recent memory. My crew had been deployed from our home district in Flagstaff up to an area outside Kayenta, a Navajo Nation town in the northeastern corner of Arizona near Monument Valley. We were doing structure protection work and controlled burn operations along a ridge above a dry wash about 12 miles northeast of town. By that point in the season, we'd been going hard for about 6 weeks straight, and everyone on the crew was running on 4 hours of sleep and whatever snacks somebody's family had mailed to base camp. We were camping out of a mobile operations vehicle at the trailhead, and I had the early morning watch that night, 4 to 6 a.m., which mostly just meant sitting in the cab of the truck with the radio on and watching for any change in conditions. The rest of the crew was asleep in their bags under a tarp 20 yards away. The sky was clear, no wind, full moon. It was bright enough that you could read by it, which I'd done for the first hour. Somewhere around 4:45, I heard something moving in the brush to the northeast of the trailhead, maybe 60 to 70 yards out. It was consistent movement, deliberate, not the random sound of small animals going about their business. My first thought was coyotes, which are everywhere out there and have a way of moving that sounds almost purposeful. My second thought, about half a second later, was that it was too loud and too slow for coyotes. Whatever it was big and in no particular hurry. I got out of the cab quietly, didn't wake the crew, and walked to the edge of the cleared area with my headlamp. I switched it on and swept the brush. The movement stopped the instant the light came on. I held the beam steady and waited. Nothing moved. I was about to write it off as a mule deer or something similar when the smell hit me. I'm going to do my best to describe it and fall short, because smell is the hardest sense to translate into words. It was deeply organic, like something at the threshold between alive and not, like wet decomposition but with something else under it, something almost chemical. It was strong enough that I took a step backward and actually gagged a little, and it was coming from directly in front of me where I'd heard the movement. I'm a wildland firefighter. I've been around dead animals, smoke, chemicals, all of it. I have a high tolerance for bad smells. The smell made me physically uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the smell itself, and everything to do with some older, lower part of my brain that was registering something I had no framework for. I went back to the truck. I left the headlamp on and aimed it at the brush. I sat in the cab with the door locked, which I recognized even at the time as a somewhat absurd thing to do, given that a truck door would stop nothing in the real world. But I felt better with it locked. The smell faded after about 10 minutes. The brush didn't move again. When the rest of the crew woke up at 6, I told them I'd heard something big moving around in the night, and to check their gear was accounted for. I didn't mention the smell. Our crew lead, a woman named Jess Ortega, asked what kind of big, and I said probably elk. She nodded and poured her coffee, and that was the end of it. But here's the part I've never said out loud to anyone. During the 10 or 15 minutes I was sitting in that truck with the headlamp aimed at the brush, I had a very clear, very insistent feeling that whatever was out there was watching me back. Not looking in the general direction of the light, watching me specifically. Looking at me the way a person looks at another person. I've been around enough animals in the field to know the difference between an animal registering your presence and reacting to it, versus something that is studying you with intention. This felt like the second thing, and it felt patient. I've never been back to that trailhead. Different deployments, different districts since then. I don't know that I'd refuse to go back if ordered. I'd probably go, but I'd bring more lights. Story 4, submitted by Nadine Kowalski, 52, former ER nurse, Duluth, Minnesota. I worked 14 years in the emergency room at St. Mary's Medical Center in Duluth, and I say former because I retired early on medical grounds, though the medical grounds in question are not exactly the kind I'd be comfortable explaining to most people, so I just say medical grounds and leave it there. What happened to me in the winter of 2015 is the reason I left, and I've spent a long time deciding whether to tell it to anyone at all. The only reason I'm doing it now is that my therapist, a good woman, who has heard all of it and has never once looked at me like I'm inventing things, suggested that putting it into words and sending it out into the world might help me let go of the weight of it. So here it is. On the night of February 11th, 2015, I was working the overnight shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was a busy stretch by Duluth winter standards, mostly slip and fall injuries. One cardiac, a teenager with alcohol poisoning who would be absolutely fine. Around 1 in the morning, things quieted down the way they sometimes do in the middle of the night, that strange low-tide hour between the last of the evening traumas and the first of the early morning ones. I was charting at the nursing station when a man was walked in through the front entrance by a security guard. He'd been found outside. That was all the guard told me. Found outside, walking in circles in the parking lot in a hospital gown, no coat, no shoes, in temperatures that were around -14 with wind chill. He was ambulatory, which was the first miracle, and he appeared alert, which was the second. He was a large man, well over 6 feet, probably late 50s, gray hair, a face I'd describe as weathered in the way that people who work outside get weathered. There was no hypothermia presentation that I could find, which was medically astonishing given the exposure, time, and conditions. I asked him his name. He told me it was Harlan. I asked him his last name. He thought about it for a moment, the way you pause when trying to recall something you haven't thought of in a while, and then he said he wasn't sure. I asked him if he knew where he was. He looked around the ER and said a hospital. I asked him if he knew how he'd gotten outside without shoes or a coat in February. He said he'd been told to go outside and wait. I asked him who had told him that. He turned and looked at me, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to convey in writing. His eyes were completely clear. Not the eyes of a confused person, not the eyes of someone in the grip of a psychiatric episode, not even the eyes of someone who had just been through something traumatic. They were calm, present, and they were looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as an apology, like he knew something I didn't and was sorry about it. He said, "The one's in room 4. We didn't have a room 4 and overnight in that configuration. What he was likely referring to was exam bay 4, which at that hour was empty. I told him that bay 4 was empty. He shook his head very slightly and said, "Not when I came in." I got him warmed up, got labs drawn, got the attending to come look at him. His core temperature was normal. Labs were unremarkable. Neuroassessment was normal. The attending and I exchanged a look that said the same thing. This man has no business being physically fine after however long he'd been out there, and yet here he is. He stayed overnight for observation. By morning, he'd told us his last name Dupree, and that he lived alone outside Cloquet, about 20 miles west. His car was found in the hospital lot, which meant he'd driven himself in at some point. The surveillance footage showed him arriving in his car at 11:42 p.m., walking through the front entrance, and then the footage did something that our security supervisor described as a glitch. There was a gap of 31 minutes, in which the lobby cameras showed nothing but static, after which the footage resumed with Harlan walking back out the front door into the parking lot. There was no footage of him ever approaching exam bay 4. There was no footage of anyone else in the lobby during that 31 minutes. Harlan Dupree was discharged the next afternoon with a clean bill of health. He thanked me by name, though I don't recall introducing myself, shook my hand and walked out. His grip was unusually cold for a man who'd been inside and warm for 16 hours. 3 weeks later, I started having nightmares. Not about Harlan specifically, not about anything I could clearly identify. Just a recurring sense of being watched in a very bright white room by something that I knew was there, but couldn't turn my head far enough to see. Every night for 4 months. And then they stopped. And 4 months after that, I handed in my resignation. I don't think Harlan Dupree was dangerous. I don't think he meant me any harm. But I also don't think that what happened to him that night had a medical explanation. And I had spent 14 years in a field that runs on medical explanations. And once you've had that foundation knocked out from under you, it's very hard to go back to standing on it. Story 5. Submitted by Clint Yarborough, 61. Retired Army Corps of Engineers surveyor, Natchitoches, Louisiana. People who've never spent time in the Kisatchie National Forest tend to romanticize it. They picture Spanish moss and tupelo trees and maybe an alligator lounging on a log, which is fair enough because that's roughly what you get. What the postcards leave out is how quickly the light goes in those bottomlands. You'll be walking through a corridor of water oak and cypress and it'll be full afternoon. And then you turn a corner and it might as well be dusk. The canopy closes over you like a lid. I spent 8 years doing survey work in and around Kisatchie for the Corps, and I got comfortable enough with that landscape that I stopped feeling what most people feel the first time they're in it, which is the very reasonable sense that they are being tolerated rather than welcomed. By the time I finished that job, I thought I knew those woods. I was wrong about that. What I'm about to describe happened in October of 2003 on a survey trip I made alone, which was against protocol, but not unheard of for quick verification runs into the Catahoula unit of the forest, which is the least visited section and the furthest from any major road. I'd been in there dozens of times. I had my equipment, my GPS unit, and a radio, lunch, and a cooler, the whole setup. It was a clear fall day, about 70 degrees, perfect working conditions. I'd been out maybe 3 hours and was working a transect line near a drainage channel when I found the first marker. Now, survey markers get put in place for all kinds of reasons by all kinds of agencies. And finding one you didn't place yourself isn't unusual. But this one was wrong in ways that took me a minute to fully process. The marker was a wooden stake, which is old-fashioned, but not impossible. And it was painted the orange-red that the Corps used in the 1960s. But the stake itself wasn't weathered the way a 40-year-old stake should be. It looked recent. And the notation scratched into it wasn't in any survey notation system I'd ever been trained on. It was a series of symbols that were close enough to standard notation to look like it at first glance. But when I got out my field book and compared them, they weren't matching anything. I noted it in my field book, photographed it, and kept working. Found another one about 140 yards further along. Same stake, same paint, same unreadable notation. Then a third. They were forming a line, and the line was not parallel to any survey transect I had on record for that area. The line was moving in a direction that didn't correspond to any property boundary, easement, utility corridor, or drainage management zone I was aware of. It was heading northeast into the deepest part of the drainage, and I followed it because that's what a surveyor does when he finds a line he doesn't recognize. The sixth stake was in a clearing I hadn't been in before, which surprised me because I thought I knew that unit well enough to have a mental map of its clearings. It was maybe half an acre, perfectly circular in a way that felt unlikely for a natural opening, and the ground was clear of undergrowth in a way that suggested it was cleared regularly. In the center was a structure. I want to be measured about describing it because I don't want to overstate it. It wasn't large, it was maybe 8 feet tall, assembled from split logs and what looked like old cable wire, and it formed a kind of open framework, like a skeleton of a building without walls. It was old, I could tell from the weathering of the wood, but it had been added to recently. Some of the wire was bright and new. Things had been hung from the upper framework, tied on with wire and cord. Animal bones, mostly, and pieces of what looked like rusted metal tools. And at the base of the 4 corner posts, each with a small cairn of river stones around it, were 4 more stakes. I took photographs, I took GPS coordinates, and then I left, faster than I'd walked in, which is something that doesn't embarrass me to admit. I ran the coordinates when I got back to the office, and the location corresponded to a parcel of land that had been in private ownership since 1887, but had no active permits, no recorded structures, no utility connections, and no record of any survey work since a boundary survey in 1962. Nobody had filed a work plan for anything in that section in 40 years. I flagged it to my supervisor, who said he'd look into it. 3 months later, I asked him about it, and he said it turned out to be an old hunting camp, nothing to worry about. I accepted that because what else do you do? But I pulled the 1962 boundary survey from the archives on my own time, and the section it covered didn't include the clearing I'd been in. The clearing was outside the surveyed boundary entirely, which meant there was no record of that land being surveyed or documented by anyone at any time. An unmarked, unrecorded parcel of land in the middle of a national forest, with a structure on it that nobody officially knew about, maintained by someone who'd never filed for a permit to be there. I retired 6 years later. I never went back to the Catahoula unit on my own. Story 6. Submitted by Priya Vasanthakumar, 34, software engineer, Portland, Oregon. I need to preface this by saying I'm a deeply, almost pathologically skeptical person. I have a computer science degree from Oregon State, I read primary sources. I don't believe things without evidence. And I hold my own experiences to that same standard. Which is why what happened to me in the summer of 2019 on the Oregon coast has been so persistently difficult to just file away and move on from. Because I can't explain it in a way that satisfies my own standards. I've tried many times and I keep arriving at the same wall. I'd gone down to the coast for a long weekend on my own. I'd rented a small house in a town called Neskowin, which is about an hour and a half south of Portland. And I was planning to do exactly nothing for 3 days. Read, cook, walk on the beach, sleep a lot. Neskowin is a tiny town, maybe 300 permanent residents, one little market, a golf course. The beach there is notable for Proposal Rock, a big forested rock just offshore that you can walk to at low tide, and for the Ghost Forest, a collection of ancient Sitka spruce stumps, maybe 2,000 years old, that stick up out of the sand at low tide, remnants of a forest that was drowned by an earthquake centuries ago. I'm going to skip to the second night because the first night was uneventful. The second night I walked down to the beach after dinner around 9 o'clock when it was just getting fully dark. The tide was out, the ghost forest was visible, those gray stumps coming up out of the flat sand, and there was enough of a moon that I could see reasonably well once my eyes adjusted. I had a flashlight, but I wasn't using it. I walked out among the stumps for a while because I find them beautiful, in a melancholy way, and I wanted to sit with that feeling. I was maybe 200 yards from the high tide line, sitting on one of the larger stumps and just listening to the water, when I heard someone say my name, not shouted, not called out across a distance, said clearly and quietly as if someone were standing directly behind me. The sound of it was so close and so normal that my first physical reaction was just to turn around, expecting to see someone I knew, which makes no sense because I knew nobody in Neskowin, and I'd told exactly one person where I was going, my roommate back in Portland. Nobody was behind me. I swept the flashlight in a full circle. The beach was empty in all directions as far as the beam reached. The nearest stump large enough for a person to hide behind was at least 30 feet away. The sand was flat and undisturbed between me and it. I had not been asleep. I had not been daydreaming. I had been sitting there, fully awake, listening to the surf. And someone had said my name. My full first name, Priya, not a nickname, not a sound that could be mistaken for a word. I went back to the rental house, and I stayed there for the rest of the night and most of the following day. I tried to reason through it. I considered whether the acoustic properties of the beach might carry sound in unusual ways, whether I could have heard someone far off saying a word that sounded like my name. I considered auditory hallucination, which is possible with sleep deprivation, except I'd been sleeping fine. I went back through every explanation I could construct, and none of them were fully satisfying. But here's the part that I keep coming back to. When I left Neskowin on Sunday afternoon and drove back to Portland, I called my roommate to tell her I was on my way. She asked how the trip had been. I said mostly fine, a little strange on Saturday night. She asked what happened. I told her. There was a pause, and then she told me something she'd forgotten to mention when I left. The rental house I'd booked, she'd looked it up out of curiosity after I left, had reviews that mentioned strange things about the beach near the ghost forest. 3 separate reviews from different years mentioned hearing their names called on the beach at night. 2 of them said they checked and there was no one there. The third said they heard it twice and left the next morning. 3 different people, different years, who did not know each other. Same beach, same experience. I haven't been back. Story 7, submitted by Walter Osibonsu, 47 long-haul truck driver, Amarillo, Texas. I drive the I-40 corridor more than any other stretch of highway in the country. Albuquerque to Oklahoma City, sometimes beyond in both directions, depending on the load. I've been doing it for 19 years, and there is no segment of pavement between here and the East Coast that I know better. I know where the good truck stops are. I know which rest areas have working showers. I know the spots where your radio picks up nothing but static, and the spots where you can get a clear signal from a station in a completely different state. I know this highway the way I know my own apartment. What I'm going to tell you happened in April of 2018, westbound, somewhere in the stretch between Moriarty and Albuquerque in New Mexico. It was around 3 in the morning. I'd left Amarillo late in the day, made a fuel stop in Santa Rosa, and I was making good time. Clear sky, no wind, no traffic to speak of. I was awake, alert, hadn't had any issues on the road. I had the radio on low, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, which is the state you get into on a long night run, not daydreaming, not sleepy, just a sort of highway meditative state. I came up on someone walking on the shoulder. Now, this is not completely unheard of on I-40. People have car trouble, people are stranded, people make bad decisions in remote areas. But this stretch of road is one of the loneliest in New Mexico, no town for miles in either direction. Nothing but high desert scrubland in the dark. Seeing a pedestrian there at 3 in the morning was unusual enough to bring me out of that meditative state immediately. My first instinct was to slow down, pull onto the shoulder, see if the person needed help. I've done it before. It's just what you do. But as I started to brake, something stopped me. I don't have a clinical name for what stopped me. It was just a very sudden and very insistent wrongness that I felt in my chest, the same way you feel a gear slipping before you hear it. Something physical and immediate. I kept going past the figure. As I did, my headlights swept over them and I got maybe 2 seconds of clear visibility. The person was wearing a long coat, which struck me as strange for April in New Mexico, even at night. They were walking at a normal pace. And the thing that bothered me most, the thing I kept coming back to for the next 100 miles until I got to Albuquerque, was the position of their head. They were walking forward, moving in the direction of oncoming traffic, the way you're supposed to on a shoulder. But their head was turned to look directly back over their shoulder at me as I passed. Not a quick glance. A full, deliberate turn watching me go by. I've been passed by truckers while walking along a road. You glance up, you might nod or wave, and then you keep moving. You don't hold your head in a complete reverse turn while your body keeps walking forward. That's not how people's bodies work when they're doing it casually. That's a conscious, sustained effort. I watched my mirrors after I passed. The figure was visible for maybe 20 seconds in my driver's side mirror, still walking, head still turned to watch my truck. Then the curve of the road took them out of sight. I thought about calling it into the state police, but I didn't have anything specific to report. A person walking on the highway at night is strange, but not technically illegal or reportable. I mentioned it to the dispatcher when I checked in, and she logged it as a welfare check request, but said she'd pass it along if any units were in the area. I don't know if anyone ever went to look. I've passed through that same stretch several hundred times since then. I watch the shoulder more carefully now. I've never seen it again, but I've also never entirely gotten back to that highway meditative state. Some part of me is always watching the shoulder now, which is probably the smarter way to do it anyway. Story 8. Submitted by Lacey Drummond, 41, middle school science teacher, Corbin, Kentucky. I used to love camping. I want to say that first so you understand what I'm describing is a real loss for me. I went every summer growing up with my family, and after I got married, I kept going with my husband, Darren, and eventually with our kids once they were old enough. We had a whole system gear packed by Thursday night, route planned, campsite reserved weeks in advance. It was the thing I looked forward to more than almost anything else in the year. I don't camp anymore, haven't since 2016. In July of that year, Darren and I left the kids with my mother and went on a long weekend trip on our own to Cumberland Falls State Resort Park in Whitley County. We'd been there before and loved it. The falls are extraordinary. You can see a moonbow, an actual rainbow cast by moonlight, on clear nights near the full moon, which is one of only a handful of places in the Western Hemisphere where that's reliably possible. The campground there is well maintained, and we had a site in the upper loop that we were familiar with from a previous visit. The first night was wonderful. We hiked to the falls, we saw the moonbow, we sat up by the fire later than we should have. Classic. We went to sleep happy and woke up Saturday morning the same way. Saturday night is what I'm writing about. We'd come back from an afternoon hike around 6, cooked dinner, cleaned up, gotten a good fire going. The campground was busy for a summer Saturday, families nearby, the sound of kids, somebody a few sites over playing music. Normal. By 9 o'clock, things had quieted down considerably, as families with young children turned in. By 10, it was mostly still. We stayed up by the fire until about 11, and then we went to bed. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. Probably between 1 and 2. I heard something outside the tent, close to the left side panel. I want to be careful about this description because I've gone over it so many times in my head that I know exactly what I heard and exactly what it wasn't. It wasn't an animal moving through the campsite. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of someone standing outside our tent, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Slow, deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. I lay there for a moment, hoping I was wrong. Then I heard Darren's breathing change beside me, going from the deep, even rhythm of sleep to something shorter and shallower, and I knew he was awake too. Neither of us said anything. The sound outside continued. Shift, pause, moving along the left side of the tent, slowly, toward the door end. Darren put his mouth close to my ear and said, very quietly, that he was going to unzip the door and look. I grabbed his arm. I don't know why exactly, except that I was suddenly and completely certain that he should not do that. We'd both heard enough of the sound by then to know it was a person, not an animal, and the nature of how they were moving. The careful slowness, the clear awareness of where our tent was. The fact that they were continuing toward the door made my whole body go cold. We lay completely still. We didn't speak. The sound continued to the tent door zipper and then stopped. We both heard it stop right there. And then nothing. For what felt like a very long time, nothing at all. In the morning, there were impressions in the soft dirt around our tent. Boot prints, large, circling the tent completely. They approached from the trees behind our site, circled the tent twice, and then went back into the trees. There were no prints approaching from the campground road or from the direction of any other campsite. Whoever it was had come from the dark end of the site, from the woods. We packed up and left before breakfast. Darren reported it to the park office. The ranger we spoke to wrote it down and told us that they occasionally had issues with people coming through the campground from the trail system at night, and asked if we'd noticed anyone acting strangely earlier in the evening. We hadn't. He said they'd increased patrols on the upper loop. I believe he was telling the truth. I believe it was probably a person, an actual human being, who walked out of those woods and spent several minutes standing and circling our tent in the middle of the night. I don't know why. I don't know what they intended. And the not knowing is exactly the thing that keeps me from ever sleeping in a tent again. Because whatever they intended, we only avoided it because we stayed still and said nothing and didn't unzip that door. Story 9, submitted by Greg Ahern, 55, retired commercial fisherman, Kodiak, Alaska. Most of the stories I have from 22 years of commercial fishing out of Kodiak aren't the kind you tell in polite company, and that's not because they're obscene, it's because they're about the sea, and people who haven't spent time on it don't have the framework for what the sea actually is. They think of it as a place, a backdrop, a thing you look at from the shore. It's not that. It's a force with its own set of rules. And when you work on it for long enough, you stop trying to translate those rules into terms that make sense on dry land. You just operate by them. I operated by them for 22 years, and I respected the sea deeply, and it mostly respected me back. But there was one trip in August of 2007 that sat outside the rules I thought I understood. And I'm going to tell you about it, not because I want you to have an explanation for it. I don't have one. But because I've told it to 2 other fishermen who were on that boat, and they remember it exactly the way I do, which matters to me. The fact that it isn't just my memory. We were about 40 miles offshore, southwest of the island, running long line for halibut. 4 of us on board, me, my deckhand, Sonny Picard, a younger guy named Oscar Bengtson, who'd been with me 2 seasons, and my engineer, a woman named Ruth Matalau, who knew diesel engines better than anybody I've ever hired. Standard crew for a trip that length. We'd had a good first day, lines were producing well. Weather was mild for August on the Gulf, which is to say it was cold and choppy, but nothing you couldn't work in. The second night out, around 2 in the morning, I was on watch in the wheelhouse while the others slept. Flat black night, no moon, just the instruments and the running lights. The GPS showed us right where we should be, nothing unusual on the radar. And then the radio, which had been on the usual working frequency, produced a voice. This was not an unusual event in itself. You hear radio traffic out there, constantly other vessels, the Coast Guard, weather broadcasts. But this voice wasn't on any channel I recognized. It wasn't on 16, the emergency channel. It wasn't on any of the standard working channels. It was present across multiple frequencies simultaneously, which is not how radio transmission works. When I scanned through the channels, I could hear it on each one I landed on, at the same volume, which should be impossible. The voice was calm and clearly articulate, and it was giving directions. Not a distress call, not weather information, not vessel traffic. Directions as if reading from a route, a sequence of compass headings and distances in nautical miles. The voice was male and spoke with no detectable accent. The directions, if followed, would have taken us south-southwest, at increasing distances from our position, away from all known fishing grounds, away from the shipping lanes, into open ocean. I listened to it for about 10 minutes. It repeated the same sequence twice with no variation. I woke up Ruth and had her listen and asked her if she'd ever encountered anything like it. She said no. She pulled out the secondary radio to see if it was picking it up too. It was. The voice was on the secondary radio as well, at the same volume, same frequency and possibility. We didn't follow the directions. We logged the time and the content in the logbook. I still have that log, and I called the Coast Guard on 16 to ask if they had any unusual radio traffic reports in our area, and they said no. They asked if we had a distress situation. I said no. They said to call back if conditions changed and signed off. At around 3:30, the voice stopped mid-sentence and didn't continue. Both radios returned to normal. The rest of the trip was uneventful. When we got back to Kodiak, I asked around the docks. One other vessel that had been working grounds maybe 15 miles from us that night reported something similar, but dismissed it as a radio malfunction. I asked Oscar, a few years later after he'd gone to work on a different boat, if he still thought about it. He said not regularly, but that whenever he was on night watch and the radio got quiet, yes, he did. I never found an explanation. I've asked people with electronics and radio backgrounds, and the only thing anyone has offered is that it might have been some kind of freak atmospheric ducting event that bounced a signal from somewhere distant onto multiple frequencies. That's possible, I suppose. But atmospheric ducting doesn't explain why the directions, if you look at them on a chart, pointed to a position in the middle of open ocean with nothing recorded there. Nothing on the charts, nothing on any fish finder. Just open water with no name, no marking, and no reason for any vessel to be there. Story 10. Submitted by Tamara Bigelow, 36, forensic accountant, Richmond, Virginia. My job requires a very precise, very linear kind of thinking. I follow numbers. I find where they don't add up and I figure out why. I'm not a person who jumps to conclusions or who fills in gaps with things that feel right, rather than things that can be demonstrated. I mention this because the experience I had in the summer of 2020 is one that I have subjected to the same rigorous accounting that I apply to financial documents, and I keep arriving at the same result. The numbers don't add up, and I cannot find the discrepancy. I'd inherited a small piece of land from my great-aunt in Amelia County, Virginia, about an hour southwest of Richmond. It was 11 acres of mixed pine and hardwood, a seasonal stream, and a collapsing structure that had been a barn or storage building of some kind about a century ago. My great-aunt had owned it for decades and never built on it. I went out to look at it with the intention of deciding whether to sell it, develop it, or just hold it. The land had a gravel track running in from the county road, maybe a quarter mile, and I drove in on a Sunday afternoon in late June. I parked where the track ended at a clearing near the collapsed building and walked the property for about 2 hours, noting what I had and thinking through options. It was pleasant work. Hot but pleasant. The property was overgrown in a comfortable way. Blackberries along the edges of the clearing, mature trees with actual shade. It was on my way back toward the car that I found the photographs. They were in a weatherproof plastic sleeve, the kind you'd use for outdoor documents, tucked between two boards of the collapse structure. The sleeve had been there long enough that it had soil stains on it, but the seal was intact and the contents were dry. Inside were 6 photographs, printed on standard letter paper, not professional prints, black and white. The images were of the property, my property, the clearing, the track, the building, the tree line along the stream. This might not seem alarming in itself until I tell you that one of the photographs was of my car. My car, my actual car, parked exactly where I had parked it 40 minutes before, taken from a position in the tree line that I could roughly triangulate as being about 60 feet from where I was standing, taken that day. I'm certain of this because there was a glare on the windshield in the photograph that matched the afternoon sun's position exactly, and the windshield had a crack in the lower right corner that I had been meaning to get repaired for months. My windshield. My specific, individually cracked windshield. Photographed within the last 40 minutes and placed in that sleeve and tucked into those boards while I was walking the back of the property. The other 5 photographs were of the property, but they weren't from that day. They were taken in different seasons. One showed snow, one showed the leaves at full summer, one appeared to be fall. Different times of year, same property. Someone had been documenting this land across multiple seasons and had left those photographs there, along with one taken of me specifically, today, within the hour. I walked back to my car faster than I care to admit. I drove to the county road and called the Amelia County Sheriff's Office from there. 2 deputies came out that afternoon. They looked at the photographs. They walked the property. They found no one, no additional materials, no evidence of a camp or any kind of permanent presence. They kept the photographs as evidence and told me they'd do additional drive-bys on the county road. Nobody was ever identified. No one was ever found. I have since sold the property. The buyer didn't ask about the history, and I disclosed what I was legally required to and nothing more. I think about those photographs more than I'd like to. Not the ones of the land, the one of my car. Because whoever placed it there had to have arrived after me, walked past my car while I was out on the back acreage, taken that photograph, printed it somehow, placed it in the sleeve, tucked it into the building, and been gone by the time I came back, in under 2 hours, in a county with no print shop within 15 miles, with a printer that was presumably mobile or preloaded. The logistics of it are almost as disturbing as the intention behind it. Almost. Story 11, submitted by Obina Reyes, 43, high school football coach, Beaumont, Texas. I grew up in Beaumont and I have lived here my whole life, which means I have a very specific relationship to the bayous and the woodlands along the Neches River that most people from somewhere else don't understand. I played in those woods as a kid. I ran my dog through the bottomlands for years. I know the difference between a wild hog moving through the brush and a deer, between a nutria and an armadillo in the dark, between the things that are supposed to be there and the things that aren't. I want to establish that context before I tell you what happened in the fall of 2019. My father owns a piece of land outside China, Texas, which is a small community about 20 miles north of Beaumont on the edge of the Big Thicket. The Big Thicket National Preserve is one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems in North America. And also, if you ask the people who've grown up adjacent to it, one of the genuinely strangest places in the country. There's a reason the people who've lived near it for generations have been telling stories about it for as long as there have been people near it. The place has a quality to it that is very hard to name directly. It is dense in a way that feels like intention. My dad had a deer blind on his property that he'd been hunting from for years, and he'd asked me to go check on it in October before deer season opened, make sure the blind was structurally sound and the ladder was safe, clear any brush that had grown up around the approach trail. Simple maintenance work, an afternoon's worth at most. I'd done it before. I got out there around 1 o'clock. The approach trail through the timber was about half a mile, marked with orange flagging that my dad had put up years ago. I had my tools, my blaze orange vest, a bottle of water. The walk-in was normal. I've walked that trail dozens of times and I know every bend in it. What I found at the blind, however, was not normal. The blind itself was fine. The ladder was fine. But around the base of the blind tree, arranged in a circle that was clearly deliberate and clearly recent, were 14 deer skulls. All of them were clean, no flesh, no hide, no evidence of recent death. These were old skulls, bleached white, the kind you find in the woods when the process is long finished. But they had been placed there deliberately, facing outward in a ring, evenly spaced. Inside the ring of skulls, scratched into the exposed root system of the blind tree, were marks that I could not identify as any language or symbol system I recognized. I'm a high school football coach, and I am not given to literary description. So I'll just say plainly that standing inside that ring to look at those marks felt deeply, viscerally wrong in a way that made me want to step back out of it immediately. So I did. I took photographs with my phone. I called my dad, who'd never seen anything like it on his property before. I didn't touch any of the skulls. I did my maintenance work on the blind from the ladder without removing anything from the ground, and then I walked back to my truck and drove home. My dad called the Tyler County Sheriff's Office, who sent a deputy out the following week. The deputy was polite and took a report and said it might be kids from the high school exploring the woods and leaving things around. He acknowledged it was unusual, but said there was nothing actionable without evidence of a crime. My dad went back the following month and the skulls were gone. The marks in the root system were still there. He hunted from that blind all season and never had an issue. He still uses it. He is a braver man than I am. I haven't been back to that blind and I've been honest with him about why. He tells me I'm overthinking it. Maybe he's right. But I keep coming back to the arithmetic of 14 skulls, arranged in a perfect circle, all facing outward. Someone measured that. Someone counted. And the thing I cannot stop wondering about is whether they were facing outward to keep something in or to keep something out. Story 12, submitted by Annalisa Harmon, 28, graduate student in geology, Tucson, Arizona. I want to be straightforward about my expertise before I get into this, because I think it's relevant. I'm completing a PhD in geomorphology, which is the study of how landscapes form and change. I know the rock formations of the American Southwest better than I know most things, and I've spent more time in more remote corners of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts than most people would choose to. I am comfortable in that landscape. I know its rhythms and its hazards. I say this so that you understand that when I tell you I was disoriented in a way I cannot account for, that carries some weight coming from me. This happened in February of 2022 in the backcountry of Saguaro National Park West, outside Tucson. I was doing independent fieldwork, mapping a section of Bellada that's the gently sloping alluvial fan country at the base of the Tucson Mountains. And I had a planned route that I'd walked partially before. I had GPS, paper maps, a full hydration pack, all appropriate gear for a winter day hike. The weather was clear and mild, ideal conditions. I want to walk you through the timeline as precisely as I can, because the timeline is the thing that doesn't work. I started at the Kings Canyon trailhead at 7:45 in the morning. My route would take me west along the Bajada for approximately 4 miles, after which I'd arc south and return on a parallel track, a roughly 8-mile loop that I'd budgeted 4 hours for at a comfortable pace, including fieldwork stops. At around 9:45, roughly 2 hours in, I was in a section of Bajada I hadn't been in before, taking sediment samples and making notes. Everything normal. I looked up from my notebook at some point to check my surroundings and take a GPS reading, and I was somewhere I didn't recognize. This requires explanation because the word "didn't recognize" is doing a lot of work there. It wasn't that the landscape looked unfamiliar in the vague way any desert looks unfamiliar at first glance. I'm a geologist. I read rock formations and drainage patterns the way other people read street signs. I could tell you exactly what kind of bajada I was on, what the primary parent rock was, what the drainage history of the alluvial material under my feet looked like. I can orient myself by geology and terrain I've never physically been in before, and I'm telling you that the terrain I was standing in did not correspond to any section of Saguaro National Park West that I had on my maps or in my prior knowledge. The rock composition was wrong. I was standing on material that should not have been there, based on the geological survey of that area. The drainage patterns were wrong. The aspect of the terrain was wrong relative to where the sun should have been, and the GPS gave me a reading that placed me in according to my map, well outside the park boundary, which was not possible given how long I'd been walking and in what direction. I sat down. I took a breath. I checked the GPS again. Same reading. I checked my compass. The compass agreed with the GPS on which direction was north. The problem wasn't my orientation. The problem was my location, which didn't add up. I spent about 30 minutes trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what the data was telling me, and I couldn't do it. In the end, I just started walking north, which should have taken me back towards the mountain front. After about 45 minutes of walking, I hit terrain I recognized, and my GPS then placed me approximately a 1.25 miles northeast of where I'd been when I looked up from my notebook. I had traveled northwest for 2 hours at a measured pace, and my GPS told me I ended up northeast of my starting position. I got back to the trailhead at 2:15 p.m. That was 6.5 hours after I started, not 4. I have talked to 3 other field researchers who work in that park, and 2 of them independently describe periods of disorientation in the backcountry west section that they couldn't explain navigationally. One of them said she'd been discussing it with a colleague who'd found references in old Spanish colonial surveys to that area being described as La Tierra que Engaña, which translates roughly as the land that deceives. Old maps, decades before GPS or modern surveying. Same location, same description. I don't have a geomorphological explanation. I have looked for one. I'll keep looking, but I've started telling my field students that if they work that bayada and they look up and something feels wrong, they should just start walking north and not stop until they know where they are. Story 13, submitted by Fern Callister, 67, retired librarian, Burlington, Vermont. I'm the oldest person who's ever submitted a story to this channel, or so the person who runs it tells me, which I find both flattering and mildly concerning about the age demographics of the listenership. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me in 1987, which means I've been carrying it for 37 years. And the reason I'm sending it now is that my granddaughter showed me this channel, and when I was done listening to it, I said out loud, and to nobody, I know exactly how those people feel. And then I sat down and wrote this. In the summer of 1987, I was 30 years old and living in a town called Craftsbury in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, which is the northeastern corner of the state. As remote as Vermont gets, and significantly more remote than most people who don't live there imagine Vermont to be. I was newly married to my husband Ron, who was a dairy farmer, and I'd taken a job as the librarian in the town's small public library, which was a 2-room affair in a converted Victorian house that served a community of about maybe 1,200 people spread across several surrounding townships. The library was closed on Sundays, and on Sunday afternoons I had developed the habit of going back in alone to do cataloging work without interruption. I had my own key. The building was quiet in a way that I loved, that particular quality of silence that old books in old rooms have, and I was genuinely happy spending those Sunday afternoons in there. In late August of that year, on a Sunday afternoon, I was in the back room cataloging a box of donated books when I became aware that someone else was in the building. I heard movement in the front room, the soft sound of footsteps on the hardwood floor. My first thought was that Ron had come to bring me home early. He did that sometimes. I called out his name. No response. The footsteps stopped when I called out. I went to the doorway between the rooms and looked into the front room. There was a girl standing near the card catalog. She was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair, wearing a dress that struck me even at the time as old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in photographs from the 1950s. She was looking down at the card catalog with her back mostly to me. I asked her if I could help her. She turned to look at me. She was a perfectly normal-looking child, except for her expression, which was the most completely blank expression I have ever seen on a human face. Not sad, not frightened, not distressed, simply absent, like looking at a face in a photograph rather than a face in a room. I asked her where her parents were. She didn't answer. I asked her how she'd gotten in since the doors were locked. She didn't answer that either. She just looked at me with that blank expression and then slowly turned back to the card catalog. I walked into the front room. And this is the part that I've told very few people, because it is the part that I cannot find a rational frame for, and I've been an irrational person my whole life. As I walked toward her, she got smaller. Not in a perspective way, not the way things look smaller as you move away from them. She was getting smaller as I moved toward her. By the time I was 5 feet away from her, she was the size of a doll, and then she wasn't there at all. I stood at the card catalog and looked at it for a very long time. Then I went back to the back room, sat down in my chair, and did not move for approximately 20 minutes. Then I packed up my things and went home and told Ron I'd had a fright. He asked what kind of fright. I said a mouse. It was the first time I had ever lied to him about anything, and it felt terrible, but I didn't have any other words for what I'd seen. A week later, I mentioned it carefully to one of the older patrons, a woman in her 80s named Edith Blanchard, who'd grown up in Craftsbury and had used that library since childhood. I described the child without saying what I'd seen happen. I just said I'd seen a young girl in the library and didn't know who she belonged to. Edith was quiet for a moment, and then said that she supposed there were still people who saw the Aldrich girl from time to time. I asked her what she meant. She said that in 1953, a girl named Ruth Aldrich, 8 years old, had gone missing from the town. No body was ever found. No explanation was ever given. People have been seeing her, or something that looked like her, in and around town for years afterward. Edith said she'd seen her herself, as a young woman, near the library, looking into the window from the street. She said it in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, as if it were a piece of local history rather than an admission of something impossible. I looked up Ruth Aldrich in the newspaper archives the library kept on microfiche. She was real. Reported missing in August 1953. Dark hair, 8 years old. Survived by her parents, both since deceased. The photograph in the newspaper was 30 years old, and the print quality was poor, but the dress in the photograph was the same dress. I worked in that library for 11 more years. I never saw that girl again. But I've never forgotten the quality of that blank expression, or the way she turned back to the card catalog, as if she had something to look for in it. I've sometimes wondered what she was looking for, and whether in 37 years of looking she ever found it. That's 13 stories from 13 different people. And I have to be honest with you, this particular collection hit me harder than most. Maybe it's the variety of it. The fact that these people come from completely different parts of the country, completely different backgrounds and jobs and ages, and yet every single one of them arrived at the same place. Something happened that they cannot account for, and they've been living with it ever since. If you've made it to the end of this one, I want to ask you something in the comments below. Have you ever had an experience like any of these, something you saw or heard or felt in a place that you couldn't explain and couldn't shake? Not looking for anything dramatic, even something small. A moment where the world felt like it wasn't following the rules it was supposed to follow. Tell me about it down below. I read everything, every single comment, and I want to hear it. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of content, someone who loves a good true story, Someone who's always said they'd love a channel like this share this video with them right now. That's genuinely the best thing you can do for this channel, and it costs you nothing but a few seconds. Make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. Hit that notification bell so you actually see the new videos when they go up. I post new narrations every week, and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming next. Because based on the submissions sitting in my inbox right now, next week is going to be something special. Stay safe out there. Lock your doors. And if you're camping this weekend, maybe sleep with one ear open.